This is Paul Dorsett, excuse me, over at Sylvan. And today's Insight session, we're going to talk about getting Stratum ready for the new year. So it's a new fiscal year, new calendar year, however you've got your environment set up. So 2021, finally. Just a couple things to note about calendars and data within Stratum. There's really no prior year maintenance that you have to worry about in Stratum. You know, some other applications, ERP systems, you might have to roll previous year data off. Maybe it only contains the current year plus, you know, 2 prior years, that kind of thing. Not such an issue with Stratum. We've got many customers out there with multiple years of history in their storage tier. And I say storage tier because I want to differentiate that from viewer as opposed to Stratum server. Stratum server, you know, you can have multiple years as you can in viewer, but you can also control through the connector in viewer what years you would like to bring into the viewer application. Got a lot of customers that might have a lot of years of history in the Stratum server side, but decide to only bring in 5 years of history in viewer. And then when there's a requirement to have additional years, they can easily include those via the connector. The only other thing I'd talk about in terms of prior year maintenance, you know, if you've got DASD kind of situations where, you know, you want to roll some years off, you know, obviously you could do that through clearing data and backing it up and clearing data. So when we look at starting to set things up for the new year, there's really 3 areas that we want to look at. One is what I would call the data storage area. And again, that's your Stratum server side, where we want to set up the actual data tables that contain the data for each of our categories. And then also need to maintain what we call the import calendar. And that's used in the import processes to figure out what bucket we want to put the data for based on that particular transaction date or whatever date you're using. So that's on the data storage side. Then there's an admin function setting up the view calendars, and the view calendars are those calendars that viewer uses to determine things like what's the current month, what are the different fiscal months or periods in your calendar or in your fiscal calendar. So we need to adjust those as well, and that involves creating what we call the view group bucket mapping as well. And then finally for viewer, kind of alluded to it earlier, you know, we want to make sure that the new year is selected in the connector, and also what we call the viewer pre-process routines, the OLAP, load OLAP and the create OMAS are also included, or updated rather, so that they include that new fiscal year. Just a couple things in preparation for maintaining the calendars and doing this setup. Really suggest sitting down, understanding your calendar structure, especially if it's not true calendar. You know, if it's a fiscal year, you know, 445, maybe it starts in this year, goes into the next calendar year. Also understanding for each of your categories of data, you know, how many buckets do each of those have? Are they daily, which we're seeing a lot of our customers going to, and as we install new instances of Stratum out on our customer base, we also include that as well, a daily calendar. Another thing to to note is how is the data stored in those data tables? Is it stored based on a calendar year or on a fiscal year? And that'll make more sense as we go through this a little bit. And then finally, identifying what view groups are being used by each category. You may have some view groups that you don't need to worry about because those categories aren't used anymore. But identifying those active view groups. And last but not least, make a backup of that Stratum server database. There's many, many tables that are used to create these view calendars. And it's always good to have a backup for that. So once you've kind of done some pre-planning, one of the things I would also suggest is laying out in Excel or whatever you want to use your fiscal calendar. It makes it just so helpful when you get to what we call the bucket mapping stage. Being able to identify things like what makes up a week, what makes up a month, what makes up a fiscal month or a fiscal period. It's really easy when you've got this information in front of you to be able to key that in to those maintenance screens. Here's just an example of, it's actually kind of an older style bucket mapping that we used to have before we went to the daily. But it's based on 64 buckets. And, to correlate to really to weeks. And why 64 as opposed to 52 or 53? Well, the 64 allows you to break up weeks that cross over months or fiscal periods. So as an example, you might, to create calendar February, that would be weeks 6 through 10. But for fiscal period, or at least what I'm calling fiscal period, starting for February, January 28th through February 24th, that would just be buckets, 5 through 9. So understanding this bucket structure and how each of those time periods or those buckets correspond to the dates, again, based on that Excel file that you put together, it's really easy to see. Okay, so actually getting into now that first kind of phase, that first section, the data storage side. So first thing we want to do is with the database install application, which again is part of that Stratum Planner set of applications, we want to use the database install. And that allows you to now define the tables and create the tables for each of your structures or categories. So in this example, you can highlight the category or the structure code, put in the year 2021, and then go ahead and select that low-level DSL. And so there's a define step, and then there's a create step. And we do this for each of the categories that we want to populate for the new year. And as you create the tables, one thing you'll see over here on the right-hand side where it says tables to create, if you have existing data in these categories, those tables are going to appear in red. And that just says, hey, there's tables there that have data. And when we punch the create tables button down here in the middle, Stratum will create all of the tables that do not have data in them. So it'll in fact go through, and if you've got prior years of tables defined but no data, it'll go ahead and drop those and recreate those as well. Now in the admin utility, under your utilities, you're going to see the import calendar. And this is where we specify by structure code or category for each year the different buckets that are going to correspond to the number of buckets in your data tables. So for each bucket, you identify what the ending date is for that particular bucket. Now this happens to be, again, a kind of a weekly structure. So as you can see, for this example, January 2008, the weeks are ending on Saturdays. And we've got a bucket here, bucket number 5, that corresponds to the end of the month. And then the next bucket would be February 2nd. So we're breaking up that calendar week into 2 separate buckets. Now again, with a daily structure, this becomes very simple to do. And in fact, you might not even have to do it. You may have in your import process code in there to figure out the day of the year and just use that. So that all depends on how you have your import processes set up. Okay, also in admin, now we're going to start looking at those view calendars. So one of the first things we want to do is for the year view set, we want to add the new year. So on the main screen there, we'd click view items. We go into this particular screen for the year, go ahead and add our new year. Now for the view groups. Now under view groups, again, each category or data source has a corresponding view group to it. And that's what enables viewer to figure out, well, somebody in viewer is asking for February, fiscal month, February. How does that relate to the buckets? So this is what we're going to do at this stage right now. So for each of the different view groups, you go ahead and select one of those on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, that just shows you what view sets have been set up for that particular view group. So in the weekly view group here, I've got year, obviously. I've got weeks, I've got months, and I've got fiscal months. You're also going to see potentially things like the based time periods, based month, based days. And that's what allows viewer to recognize the fact that somebody has asked for current fiscal month or current day or yesterday, previous month, those kinds of things. Again, how do you identify the view group that's associated with a data source? In admin, if you go under data source and select the data source that you're interested in looking at, it'll show down here at the bottom. Okay, the view buckets, the data mapping. So when you go and select view buckets, you want to identify what year you're looking at, and this is the view year. So if you've got things set up on a fiscal basis or a calendar basis, you want to select the appropriate year. And then you'll want to select one of the view sets over on the right or left-hand side to start that data mapping process. Once those two are selected, viewer will come back, or Stratum will come back and present the data. And this is where you now identify the view year, the start bucket number, and the ending bucket number. And these 3 columns, the view year, the start, and the end, that corresponds to how your data is stored in in the data tables itself. So in this example, all our data is stored on a calendar basis. So for 2017, I go ahead and select 2017. So that's going to correspond to the tables that relate to 2017. And fiscal January is going to be comprised of bucket number 1 through bucket number 4. I don't have an example here, but let's say fiscal January actually started, I don't know, December 25th of the previous year. Well, in that case, I would want to have my view year be 2016, whatever the start and end buckets for the 25th through the 31st of December. And then also, if you right click on the view year, you can also add additional buckets to that entry. So again, if I clicked on the view year, right click, say add, then I can also say, go ahead and select 2017 buckets 1 through 4. So I can merge data from 2 different sets of data tables. If I've got a fiscal year, for example, that runs, across calendar years. Now the start and end date correspond or relate to how viewer understands what time period somebody is requesting if they use the base time periods. So for example, if somebody says, show me current year or current month, well, it's going to figure out, well, today's, November 12th. Doesn't have to be 2017, but so that's going to correspond to fiscal November. So viewer will use current system date and use that as the basis for figuring out current month, previous month, next month, current day, those kinds of things. A couple things, recommendations, if you will. Talked about it before. Get a spreadsheet ready, understand your calendar and how it breaks into the Stratum time buckets for each of your categories. Take your time. One of the things I've noticed, or one of the things I'd recommend, is as you go through, especially the view buckets, the mapping, is to do one view set at a time. So if I scroll back here, for example, in here, I'm doing fiscal month. I complete this all the data mapping, go ahead and say complete. Now what's going to happen is admin will come back and say, well, wait a minute. All the other view buckets haven't been done for all the other view sets. Do you want to do that now? What I would recommend is you say no. It'll take you back to this screen, or not this screen, I'm sorry. It'll take you back to this screen. Go ahead and say save here. And that way, all the changes that you've made will be saved in the tables. Then go back and say, okay, I want to do weekly. Go do view buckets again. And then select the next view set. What I've seen a lot of people do is they'll stay on this screen, do each of the different view sets until everything's done, and then say complete. And there might be an error somewhere along the process. I'm all about taking little steps along the way, especially when you're setting up your view calendars. So Go ahead on that screen, say complete. It'll come back and say, hey, you've got some more view sets to do. Go ahead and say no, save it, then repeat to the next view set. Okay, on the viewer side, a couple of things to do on those pre-process steps. Again, I talked about the load OLAP, maybe DA load OLAP if you're up on the I series, or GI load OLAP on the server or Windows server side. There'll be a parameter in that command. A couple ways to do that. You can either say star year equals, or year equals star all, you're all set to go. Or if you've been very specific about what years you want to process with this command, just make sure that new year is out there. And then finally, on the connector side, it's pretty simple. Whoops. Go ahead and just click on that new year in the partitions. And you got to do that, remember, for each category or each measure group. There's not one global setting for the new year. You have to do it for each of the measure groups. And it's a good opportunity also if you want to go ahead and click or deselect prior years. Maybe you want to just keep 5 years of history and the current year in viewer. Go ahead and unclick that year in this screen. Keep it in mind that that doesn't impact the data on the server side. So in your relational database, all that data will still stay there. So find out you need that year back in viewer, you can go ahead and reselect it and do another cube build. Just some final thoughts, and then we'll open it up for any questions that you might have. Can you set up more than 1 year? Yeah, absolutely. The only, and I put it in quotes, downside is that those years will be viewable within viewer to the user. So, if you go out 4 or 5 years, whatever, those years are going to appear. There's not obviously going to be any data for them. Another thing to think about are setting this up for future years. You might have a situation where your fiscal year is going to run from sometime in 2021 and go into 2022. In that case, you're going to have to build the data tables for each of those years. Again, depending on how you store your data. If you do it on a calendar basis, you're going to have to do that. If you're doing it on a fiscal basis and you take into consideration that year starts in the middle of the calendar year, you're probably okay. Another thing to think about, though, is also data that's out in the future. So obviously things like budgets and forecasts, you might want to create years and tables for that kind of information. Also things like open orders. You may get to a point where you need to start thinking about even not next year, but even the next year out, because you have future orders that you need to have a space for that data.